Okay.
Okay, so first of all, I would like to thank RS21 for inviting me and for organizing this conference around Syria and imperialism. I think it's very important to still speak about revolutionary processes in the region, and especially Syria, because it has been center of discussions not only among the left but around the world as well, about is it a civil war, Syrian revolution, etc. But we'll concentrate today and in my session on the origins and development of the revolutionary process, understanding its socio-economic and political roots. So I'll not be able to enter into details, so I excuse myself in advance. And like this we have more space for the debate. Just as also we're into celebrating the 5th anniversary of the Syrian Revolution, I would just like also to pay tribute. Yesterday was the anniversary of the Kurdish Intifada in Syria, 12 years ago in 2004, where the Assad regime killed more than 40 Kurdish protesters and arrested more than 1,000. It's important to remind us of this Kurdish Intifada. It was one of the first time that, and following the Bashar Assad arrival to power in 2000, that a statue of Hafiz al-Assad was brought down. And it was, and I think, one of the first scream for freedom in the era of Bashar Assad. So, in introduction, I would like to say first that the Syrian revolutionary process has not been supported by sections of the left, sections and not the whole left, like other revolutionary processes in Egypt, Tunis, Bahrain, etc. Based basically on the fact that an analysis from above, geopolitical perspective, thinking that the Assad regime is socialist, anti-imperialist, secular, which are the three big lies, what I called, of this regime. It's neither anti-imperialist, it's neither secular, it's neither socialist. And this problematic of analyzing from above, I think, has shown in the past 5 years, is completely mad. When you see today Iran and the US collaborating, and it's been for a while, and still people calling Iran an anti-imperialist country, or seeing because Russia opposed the US, it's an anti-imperialist country. We'll have a session on imperialism this afternoon, but it's really a necessity to understand imperialism as a system, and not in which various capitalist states fight each other, but can also make agreements. And the best example, again, is the Syrian Revolution, in which all the imperialist powers want to put an end to this revolution, and not limited, as I said, to one single actor, most generally by some Western states. And we should analyze a state according to its policies regarding its popular classes and the leadership, the class base of its leadership, not its foreign policies. And this has brought also problems regarding analysis of various political movements such as Hezbollah, Daesh, for various reasons. It's not the same, but it also brought a lot of problems regarding the analysis of these political parties or other states. So this is what I'm going to show you, that the basis of support of the Syrian revolution must be based, obviously, on the solidarity of people in uprising, but on this analysis. In Egypt and Tunis, people raised for democracy, social justice, and freedom. It was the same thing in Syria. The socio-economic roots of the uprising in Syria are absolutely similar to the one in Egypt, Tunis, Bahrain, and other countries. Based on the absence of democracy, as I said, absence of social justice, increasing unemployment, poverty, especially among the youth. And to enter, if we want to understand the Syrian revolution, we have to go back to the 70s, and with the arrival of Hafiz al-Assad to power, as a symbol of reaction against the radical socializing, not socialist, but socializing policies of the Ba'ath in 63 until 70. That kicked out the old bourgeois feudal groups of Syria that was controlling, if you want, politically, economically, Syria, even before the mandate during the Ottoman Empire. But even during 63 and 70, as I said, it wasn't socialist policies because it was controlling the popular masses, establishing institutions that were more like corporations, like corporate institutions, meaning the controlling the popular masses like trade unions, women's unions, peasants' unions, etc. It wasn't in a perspective of change from below. Even though in 70, Hafez Assad came to power with the support of the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie went people in the street with the slogan, "We asked for God's help and God sent us Hafez Assad." So at this moment you have a new policy about getting closer to the conservative Gulf monarchies, collaborating with them. Also increasing neoliberal policies, but selective neoliberal policies during 30 years. It started through a policy of infitah, and this word was actually stopped in 79 because it was correlated with Sadat, infitah, and policy of peace with Israel, etc. But basically it was selective liberalization to build a new bourgeoisie linked to the Assad regime, with the old alliance with the Damascus bourgeoisie especially, and from 2000 with the Aleppo bourgeoisie as well. So during 30 years you have selective neoliberalization, increasing inequalities, etc. In the same time you have very harsh repression of any kind of democratic activities and of any trade union activities, that they were still independent trade unions. They were still independent associations. They were all completely crushed. Throughout the 70s, and with the height of the repression in 82 against the city of Hama, symbolized by the uprising of one section of the Muslim Brotherhood. So in the middle of the 80s, nearly the whole opposition is completely crushed. And just to remind you that and we can do a lot of comparison with what happened in the 70s and with the Syrian revolution today for the past 5 years. That first Assad regime concentrated its repression on Democrat activists, progressive activists. You had in Syria in the beginning of the 70s maybe one of the most radical leftist party in the whole Middle East that was called the Communist Action Organization, that even at the time supported the self-determination of the Kurdish people, that did alliance and collaboration with Palestinians within Syria and in Lebanon. These were completely crushed. And after, when this democratic and progressive opposition was completely crushed, they turned their weapons towards the Muslim Brotherhood. And maybe Laila will speak about it a bit later, but more in detail. But this is what happened actually for the past 5 years in Syria, concentrating on Democrat and progressive activists from the local councils, from the various democratic sections of the opposition, while liberating at the same time the worst Salafist jihadists from Sednaya prisons, and letting Islamic fundamentalist forces to develop. In 2000, you have the arrival of Bashar Assad to power, the son of Hafez al-Assad. So a new word was invented in Arabic for this new regime, Jumlukiyya, which is a mix of monarchy and republic, because this is what you had. When people criticize Saudi Arabia because Saudi Arabia gave the family gave its name to its country, in Syria, just to tell you, the supporters of Assad called the Syria of Assad. So it's absolutely the same in their perspectives. It's really a monarchy of the Assad. He arrived to power, not only you had a very short, what we used to call in 2000, Damascus Spring, that lasted only for a couple of months, and after a breakdown on the democratic activists again, that were mostly demanding reforms, not an overthrow of the regime, but reforms for more democracy in Syria. In this period, while the father, Hafez Assad, maintains this kind of corporate institutions, as I told you, to control the people, but in some aspect giving still services through clientelism, Assad completely broke these various institutions, establishing more and more its power through the security services. And actually what happened in Dar'a in the beginning of the revolution was something that before people used to go, for example, to their trade unions, to the women's union, to the peasant union to complain about stuff. And there would be negotiations between the local population and them to try to have services, but on a clientelist basis. These institutions were broken up completely by Bashar al-Assad because they were seen as preventing increasing neoliberal policies. So more and more, the power of the Ba'ath regime, the Assad regime, it was not anymore based on its old popular constituency, peasants, etc., but more and more on a mafia, crony capitalist bourgeoisie linked to the Assad regime. Because also among the Syrian bourgeoisie had divisions, not all of them, even though a far majority took the side of the Assad regime in Damascus and Aleppo particularly, because these two cities benefited very much from the neoliberal policies of Assad regime from 2000 to 2011. But sections of it, especially linked to Gulf business, etc., took the side of the opposition and were mostly part of the Syrian National Council, coalition, or etc. That's bref. So the power base of the Assad regime in 2010 was this mafia capitalist bourgeoisie linked to the Assad family. The cousin of Bashar Assad, Rami Makhlouf, was, according to various data, controlling directly and indirectly 60% of the economy of Syria. This is again a similar process that you saw in Egypt with the Mubarak family and in Tunis with the Trabulsi family or in Libya with the Gaddafi. So neoliberalism, not opening more space for democracy, what was the scholarly thing that we used to say in the 90s, on the opposite, it was upgrading authoritarianism within Syria. And the difference is that why also, this is a debate we can have later to enter more into detail, but the Assad regime has more to do with Libya because it's a complete patrimonial regime in the sense that you can't separate the political and economic power within Syria, which in Egypt and Tunis, the centers of the power at the top were more separated. So it means in Egypt and Tunis you could sacrifice Mubarak and Ben Ali and maintain the structure of the regime as it is. And we've seen it very clearly. In Libya and Syria you can't do it. You can't do it because the center of political and economic power is completely interlinked. Completely, 100%. It's a state that is in the hand of the Assad family. To give you an example, the security services are controlled mostly by Assad's family, Shalish, Makhlouf, and others. This does not mean, again, that this, and again we can have this debate later, that this is an Alawi regime, as some on the opposition has said. It's completely wrong. It's a regime that uses sectarianism as a mean and not as an end, which is a major difference. I always gave this example. The most impoverished region of Syria was the Jazira, northeast of Syria, mostly populated by Kurds, but the second one was Latakia and Rif Latakia, countryside of Latakia, which is mostly populated by Alawis. And historically, the bourgeoisie in Syria has not been Alawis, it's been Sunni and Christians. But this again, we can enter in details later. So, in 2011, you're at the beginning of the uprising in Egypt, Tunis, and Bahrain, you had level of poverty in Syria 33%. It came from 10% in 2000 to 33% of people living below the poverty line in 2011, with also 30% living just above the poverty line. So nearly 60% of the people living in poverty, with huge regional differences. For example, the northeast of Syria, poverty would reach around 60%. Level of unemployment among the youth was more than 50%, and between the 25 years old to 35 years old. So similar issues than in other various countries of the region that witnessed revolutions. And this is how you understand and analyze the Syrian revolution process as processes that continue, that are part of the revolutionary processes of the region for democracy, social justice, and equality. So, and Laila will speak more in detail of the popular movement. I'll just say a couple of words of the popular movement. It is true that in Syria, you didn't have a strong, independent working movement. For historical reason, again, for the repression of the Assad regime, the control of trade unions through, by corporate means, to control the masses and not to empower them. But nevertheless, in the 2000s, you have various social uprisings, not social, let's say, demonstrations in Syria. For example, in Homs, in the years 2000, there was a demonstration against the mayor of Homs that wanted to build a huge mall amongst slums or the popular neighborhoods. You had social demonstrations against this. The level of social injustice in Syria was huge at the eve of the uprising. You had around 40 to 50% of people living in informal housing, so not linked to services, etc. So this is true, you didn't have an independent worker trading movement. But in Syria, you witnessed the highest level of self-organization in all the revolutionary processes of the region. For the simple reason that the Syrian Assad regime disappeared from various regions. So you had local councils being established and taking care from A to Z of everything, welcoming refugees in the areas, organizing the demonstration, organizing schooling, etc. And the best example of this was Raqqa for 6 months, with the only capitalist province to be liberated until Idlib, etc. But during 6 months you have more than 60 popular organizations established by youth, organizing everything in the city. And they were the one to oppose Daesh and Jabhat al-Nusra, even in 2013 summer, when Daesh transformed the church of Raqqa into a torture house. The people of Raqqa went out with a cross, huge cross, chanting, the Syrian people are one and united. So, and after we can have this discussion how to fight Daesh, but it's definitely not by bombing. It gives them only more tools in their rhetoric. And they're definitely not by supporting authoritarian regimes. This is the key issue. And the other example is Aleppo. For the past 3 years, the 3 neighborhoods of Aleppo that are still hosting around 300,000 people that have been bombed nearly on a daily basis, barrel bombs, etc., whatever you want to call it, they have suffered from it, have organized the whole life of society for the past 3 years. And when the siege of Free Aleppo for the past few weeks between the Assad regime, Daesh, and the Syrian PKK, PYD, they organized everything, providing services, organizing how do we gonna take care of the siege, etc. And this also came through organizing various popular campaigns around democracy, non-sectarianism, against racism, etc. And these are the same people that opposed as well the various Islamic fundamentalist forces such as Jabhat al-Nusra, Daesh, or Jaish al-Islam in the countryside of Damascus, or Ahrar al-Sham, etc. And these are the people that you see that were able to maintain the same revolution alive. For the past 2 weeks, these are the people that came out with democratic slogans, non-sectarian slogans, and saying the revolution continues, that our objective did not change. And these people never disappeared. They were there, but they used the single occasion they had to come out with the ceasefire to be able to reclaim the revolution against all the enemies of their revolution, whether the Assad regime and its allies of Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah, and Iraqi sectarian Shia fundamentalist forces, or the others, as I spoke, Daesh, Jabhat al-Nusra, Ahrar al-Sham, and Jaish al-Islam. And I'll finish on the conclusion saying that as the Syrian people continue to chant, the Syrian revolution continues. And just as we have to understand that this is a regional process as well, it's not only in Syria. We're witnessing continuous popular uprisings and continuous democratic and social demand throughout the region. We've seen in the past, since last summer, demonstrations in Iraq challenging the sectarian political regime in Iraq with slogans saying bread, freedom, and a civil state. Challenging in Karbala last summer, so it's a Shia, very important religious city, Iran out, we want a free Karbala. Or Daesh, and this is how you see the understanding that is so much true that what some analysis you see here, demonstrations saying to the current government of Iraq, controlled by Dawah, which is a Shia fundamentalist Islamic movement, that Daesh came out from your corruption, from your political practices. And this is very true. We can go back into details after. In Egypt, you've seen for the couple of last weeks also demonstrations and people going back to the street against the dictator Sisi. In Morocco, for the past few weeks and months, you had huge social strikes, but with also a democratic demands, but huge social strikes, absolutely amazing. Tunis, in December and January, you saw in the regions that started the revolution, new demonstrations as well, asking for the similar thing than 5 years ago. Democracy, social justice. So it's not the end, because not a single force that arrive to power or want to reach power, that try to reach power, can give the solution to the problematics that we're witnessing in the Middle East and North Africa. They're not willing to give democracy from below, radical democracy from the people, not a single thing about social justice, and about equality, and struggling against sectarianism and racism. This is key today, and we have to support the people in this region having these demands. It's fundamental. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for being here. It's a privilege to be able to speak to you about this and to know that you're here and wanting to know more about Syria and about what's happening against what we all hear and be deluded with in the mainstream media. And it's such a privilege to speak after Joseph because he puts much of what I'm going to say into perspective. I want to start by a quick point on the deterioration of institutions under the Assad regime. And we all know that it's quite obvious that the Assad regime is brutal. They are against personal freedoms. They do anything for the people not to flourish and develop. The important thing in Syria is that they've done this systematically and they institutionalized this repression. And they haven't just done it by stopping people from doing the things, from doing what they want. They actually done it in a both positive and negative way. They actively destroyed all popular institutions. They destroyed, as Joseph mentioned, they have destroyed syndicates, but also unions, any public movement, and they either completely destroy them and put them out of work and practice, or put them within the Ba'ath party. So a great women union became a part of the Ba'ath, and then they had the Ba'ath Women Union, which is an institution of repression. And the same happened to the syndicates. So the lawyer syndicate, doctor syndicate was used to repress lawyers, to monitor them, to stop them from any sort of gathering and organizing, and to impose great penalties against them if they ever consider this. So and actively they've also done this through legalizing this repression. So not only it is a dictator regime, but they have engraved this in the constitution. So the constitution says that the president runs all three powers completely and fully. They don't even need to justify things by taking them to the parliament. He was the head of the Supreme Court, him personally, and he was the head of the executive power and so on. So there wasn't a legal way for us to challenge this. It is legalized. They also introduced laws that made this possible. So they changed the names of the laws every now and then. But even now, when the revolution happened, if this regime collapsed tomorrow, we wouldn't be able to take them to courts to achieve any sort of justice for decades of violations, simply because there are very strict immunity laws that they covered their backs with. And they continue to be, and they were very well contemplated and put in practice. Also, the way the laws, civil laws and criminal laws and any day-to-day laws were changed slowly in ways that wouldn't allow any development to happen on the legal front. And we saw that as the institution deteriorated and then completely collapsed. So when the legal system collapsed, we saw how that disproportionately impacted anyone who was expecting any sort of justice. So the working class had absolutely nowhere to go to achieve justice, while the bourgeoisie or the people who collaborated with the regime would always find their own ways to achieve justice. We found how that had disproportionate impact on women who did not have the arms that will allow them any sort of protection in a place where there's absolutely no rule of law or protection to civilians. And I'll explain that a little bit further. What I want to tell you about, deriving from what Joseph just mentioned, about the self-organizing in the revolution. And there's 3 points I want to mention. The first one about the scope of civil activism, and the second one about the correlation between civil activism and arming and the armed violence, and the third one about the factor of time and what we can do to challenge that. And on civil society, it's very important. I realized over time that we mean two different things. When Syrians speak about civil society and when others listen to it, we're talking about two different concepts. And as Joseph said, there was no way of any sort of political activism or involvement for Syrian youth or for any civilians at any point after the 70s. So what we call now civil society is actually political activism. It's making up for the lack of political parties, the lack of social activism, even hobbies. We didn't have the chance to go practice a hobby. We didn't have the chance to have access to information. There wasn't public libraries, and so on. So what is now reflecting as civil society is actually, if it was a normal situation, they'd be political activists, they would be members of political parties, they would be aid workers, and just people with talent as well, who would like to do things differently. And unfortunately, because of the level of violence, all of this was combined as a big umbrella of civil society that we paint with one brush now, because of how things are happening in Syria, but also because of their Western involvement, international involvement, and what they're expecting from them. So this civil society, people found their only way to act or to be active or to make a difference in the situation that they realized was wrong and had the incentive by what happened in other countries. And also there's so many analyses on why it happened and what were the factors, and there are many. One of them are better. The regime was unable to control access to information, and media and social media played a role in this, and all of that. People managed to get together and go to the streets. And it was, although we have no skills or experience in gathering and organizing, you'd see how that was acquired on the way. I'll give you an example about the coordination committees. So every little town and every little neighborhood in big cities have their own coordination committees, who first started just to organize the Friday demonstrations. And the Syria propaganda TV used to spend 2 or 3 hours every day saying how this is not actually happening. And then when it was impossible to deny, they were making claims about what actually this is. And we started saying one Friday after the other how whatever the regime is mentioning is being challenged on the ground by people in an amazing way of coordinating, but they have very little tools to do so. So one of the examples is that the regime said all of this is being recorded in studios somewhere in the West or in Qatar or wherever. And the Friday after, we saw that all citizen journalists started the photo from the sun, started recording from the sun, and then went on and showed the people, knowing that this is in these public, and they showed public areas in the cities, showing that this is not recorded anywhere. They said that these are all the same old demonstrations, and then the Friday after we saw every single coordination committee starting the video from that day newspaper and showing it. They said that there's no women in the demonstrations. And the Friday after we saw that all women in a few demonstrations went to one side, because they got lost in there, not as much in numbers. It was extremely dangerous, but also there's so many social and public factors into this, but the few women who were there went into one side and they actually showed their existence and their presence in the demonstration. So what I'm trying to say is that much of it was a reflection to a very supported attack by the regime and by their allies, and unfortunately by very, very skeptic media and groups, including the leftist groups in Europe and around the world. And I understand that there was lack of information, but also there was lack of expectations, I think. Or we Syrians think that people didn't expect us to actually go to the streets and want freedom and liberation, so they thought it must be something else, must be some sort of conspiracy. And this self-organizing has developed into having to do everything that the state is choosing not to do or failing to do. So the less state presence in particular areas, the more that this civil society, that is a massive group, had to do. They had to take care of all the aid provision, they had to take care of the daily logistics in a city, whether to take care of the garbage or to keep the electricity on or to make sure there's some sort of education, healthcare. The Syrian regime has targeted healthcare so badly during starting 2012 and after that, they had to build and operate on a very, very few resources and very few expertise and actually operate a whole health system. So this civil society managed to do that in so many areas. They succeeded in many cases, failed in some, but the fact that you have groups of individuals with no backup, with no support, doing what the state should have done in some of the most dangerous places on earth says a lot about how much trust should we put in them, expecting in the future if that regime wasn't in place. And the other thing I want to speak about is the correlation between civil society and the work of civil society and the armed violence. And it is inversely proportionate. It's very, very clear. There has been a report called Activism in Difficult Times, and it has done quantitative and qualitative data, and they have gathered and mapped civil society groups and organizations working in different regions, and they related that to the armed violence. And what it says is very, very simple. Civil society organizations and groups and activists mushroomed between 2012, when the regime started withdrawing from areas. They increased in scope, but also they increased in the amount of service that they are providing, the self-monitoring, the monitoring. They managed to learn from lessons in different areas, the coordination, organizing, all of that increased. And then in 2013, the regime started aerial bombardment and shelling in massive scale. The use of explosive weapons on populated area had obviously a devastating impact on the population, on civilians, particularly on some groups more than others. My organization has done the Women's International Day for Peace and Freedom. It's a 100 years old radical feminist organization, and one of the things we do is the impact of arming on women. And we have done a report about how use of explosive weapons in populated area is impacting women. And one of our findings is that 80% of death during pregnancy or delivery could have been prevented if there was no use of explosive weapons, because women, even if there's an operational health service, they cannot reach out to it, and they'll probably not count as casualties. So people on TV won't know that women are dying in massive numbers due to this. It impacts children immensely. Human Rights Watch said what we have known for a very long time, that for a child in Aleppo, it's safer to hold arms and go to the front lines than to be at home. Their chances of dying or being severely harmed, physically harmed by the shelling are far higher if they're at home, which is, I cannot think of a better recruitment policy of children. And it is happening, and it is growing. And unfortunately, people who were, the same research said that over 30% of civil society groups and organizations are managed and run by people who are 16 to 30. But people who are 16 to 30 in 2012 had some. First, they witnessed the early days of the revolution, and they are very much aware of the purposes of it and of who were fighting why. People who are 16 now were 10 when all of this started. They don't remember a day when there wasn't shelling and killing and blood and torture on a daily basis. And they don't remember any allies. They don't remember any support. All they remember is many, many enemies. So that will take me to my third point on the time. But going back to violence, very important for us who are not under the shelling on a daily basis to wear our lens of understanding the disproportionate impact on civilians, disproportionate impact on women, and so on. Maybe we're not traumatized as much as victims, so we can have an analysis and actually ask for what should be right. When we see the Syria talks in a room where every single one in the room is a war criminal, or a warlord, or a man who controls territory, it's our duty to say there's something wrong here. Who is representing all the civilians, who are representing the women, who doesn't have arms and do not want to kill anyone. And that is not to decrease the importance of the peace talks. I'm just saying that we can make them better, and it's a duty to make them better. And the last issue I want to raise is time. Since the Russian intervention, the Russians intervened from day one. They supply the regime with arms, they support them, they run their propaganda internationally, and they abuse the international community on their behalf. However, lately it has been a very direct intervention they are actually doing the aerial bombardment on their behalf. And if we thought that the aggression has intensified before, we haven't seen anything. The Syrian regime, we were horrified by the fact that the Syrian regime has destroyed 82 medical centers and hospitals in a year between February 2014 and February 2015. But the first month of Russian intervention in Syria, they have destroyed 40 different hospitals. And 40 different hospitals in a place like Syria that have survived for the last 5 years such horrific situation means almost the entire health system. Every last doctor. Some of these hospitals were entirely run by untrained staff and 1 or 2 doctors who are not specialized, sometimes medical students. No international organizations are able to get doctors inside. I'm just trying to show the scale of aggression, the scale of destruction. There's entire cities leveled to the ground, and the civil society that I've mentioned is trying to hold things together. And it won't be possible for years to come. We have the luxury of looking retrospectively and say, oh, this was what we've done right, this is what we've done wrong, this is what they survived in 2 or 3 years, but we won't have that in the next few years. If I came and talked to you 2 weeks ago, I would have very little to say on what we can do. But now I have so much to say. And there has been misconceptions that are nurtured and flourished in the West about who's in Syria. If for most people it's ISIS or Assad. For people who know a little bit more, it's ISIS and other extremists in Assad, and maybe some Syrians, but they're all here in London. So that's the kind of, or all the people who don't want to fight are now refugees, which is somehow true. There were situations in Syria where if you don't want to be directly involved in the militarization or in the economy of war, you need to leave the country because you have too much threats to handle individually or in small groups. However, there is concrete evidence that the people who went to the streets asking for freedom and dignity and freedom from all sorts of repression, whether by the dictatorial regime or by Islamic forces, are in the streets again. They are holding one flag that we might think it has too many political connotations, but actually it just says that this is the flag of those who oppose the regime and went to the streets calling for freedom. They managed, although it's nearly impossible, to go back to the street. 110 demonstrations in one day. The week after, and they were shelled, which made many of them scared again. And the week after, there were 54 demonstrations in the street. in the most dangerous place on earth, where the chances of them making this move will almost definitely either cost them their life if the regime decided to shell, or too many enemies who have too many arms, as of the other armed powers on the ground. Now we're waiting for all the media and political analysts and others who are saying there's nothing in Syria but armed groups to tell us who are the hundreds of thousands of people in the streets calling for freedom. Who are they? Where did they come from? I'm really looking forward to hear their argument. And while they construct their argument, we need to work on ours. The Syrian conflict is the best documented conflict in the universe ever in history. So we have every chance to know. Everyone who doesn't know chose not to know or got overwhelmed by contradicting information. At least everyone in this room has chosen to know and knows more than anyone else. And that transforms into a duty. It's a shame, back in 1982, when Assad went to a city and killed every single person there, there was one line in the BBC, and it was the only media channel that reported. So most people didn't know. We didn't know. We found out in other cities, maybe weeks or months later. It was that controlled. Now there's no excuse. We know they're here, they speak to people, they're trying. There are many people who are supporting Syrians and Syrian civilians. Unfortunately, they're not as loud as others. They're not on the left, on the British left. I know that most of the British left who cares about the people, about the working class who has started all of this, would easily support the Syrian people. But unfortunately, the very few who chose to support dictators and are very loud. They're very loud. They're out there all the time, and nobody's challenging them because they are. At least nobody challenged them on the mainstream media because they are speaking with an authority and they're saying they represent the left. And this is where we need to stop them because they don't and because they're wrong. And their impact is so massive, it's so insane, it's very hard for people to see those who fought for good causes mainly for a very long time, so sure about this and not question it. So what I'm trying to say is it's now Syria has been so hostile that at one point I felt that anybody who doesn't have arms wouldn't actually make a difference, and I thought we're unable to contribute. Now we are. Those who hold arms will have to wrap up, and they will have to take into consideration many people in the street. There's a lot of support we can do for them from here and from everywhere, and that starts by knowing more, but also by highlighting the cause to others who don't know enough, and then finding very small ways to support them and to tell them, make them know that there are people who support them because they think there isn't. Thank you.
Just a couple of questions and a reflection, I guess, is, I mean, one thing you hear a lot and that I've heard a lot for years now is this idea that the Syrian revolution was either like imaginary or, you know, has ceased to exist in recent times at some point or another. And I just find this whole idea kind of bizarre. Like I mean, a thing that Stanis used to say in the 20th century is, oh, Trotskyists don't think that, you know, there's been a revolution, since 1917. Because whenever the tanks rolled into whichever country it was, you know, we didn't celebrate enough. But it seems now almost that the dynamics kind of flipped, and now Stanis don't believe in any revolution that's happened since about 1990. And you've got this. The thing that strikes me is the sort of difference between the Rojava revolution and the kind of the sort of political almost alliance between sort of anarchists and Stalinists, as seeing this as like a kind of a model, like hyper-democratic revolution, when actually even the way that it's explained around like the assemblies, organised in various communities and different groups. Sounds very much like what was happening organically in Syria. But then the Syrian revolution, on the other hand, is dismissed out of hand. And if the key task is to centre the narratives around the sort of civil society organising and the local sort of like protest committees in various towns and stuff. Because when the demonstrations kicked off again recently, it was like, oh, you know, this is a dead revolution. Where are these hundreds of thousands of people coming from? Like, there's clearly is, as you highlight, like a massive gap in people's understandings of this. And I guess what I'm asking is what do you feel is the best way to centre the existence and like nature and the work of the civil society organised?
Just a brief question, which is that I've come across the claim that, from the left, that the revolution became, I think the phrase is prematurely militarised, that in effect it stopped being a social revolution and simply became a military struggle. And then that's an excuse for, well, it isn't really happening anymore, so we can distance ourselves from it. And I wondered if you'd say something about the politics of that, but also the actual, the actual factual events on the ground that's purporting to describe.
Yeah, I just have a question which is potentially actually related to that, or two questions. One potentially related to that last one. It just struck me when you were talking, Joseph, about the complete withdrawal of the state in lots of areas. Like, I'm embarrassingly ignorant about the actual process of the Syrian revolution, especially early on. But what did that actually mean? Was that the withdrawal of the state in terms of the provision of services, or was it also the withdrawal of the security forces? Because that makes a massive difference on whether the revolution was prematurely militarised, I would have thought. And the second was kind of related to what Miriam was saying about people getting sort of obsessed with what was the working class content of this revolution. Did it meet a certain quota and stuff? I'm kind of interested as well in a lot of the other Arab revolutions. There's a lot of talk about the sort of urban middle classes taking quite a predominant role, and it strikes me that given the nature of the economy in Syria, that's probably quite a different. There's probably a different role for the urban middle classes. I'm just kind of intrigued about whether there was that, that sort of generation of people who were well educated and had high expectations that were then kind of dashed by neoliberalism and the crisis in 2008. So whether that was...
Just on this thing of accepting arms from imperialists and so on and so forth, and being on the same side. See, there is a danger in a sort of a broad, uncritical, unthinking, not so much uncritical, but unthinking application of the main enemies at home, which is, of course, comes from Karl Liebknecht and his attack on the German ruling class within Germany, which is generally is true. But there is an obvious case where revolutionaries in Britain would have found themselves in a situation where this wasn't true, which was in September 1939. When the Chamberlain government declared war on Germany, it wasn't really the thing to do, I don't think, for revolutionaries then to actually declare themselves in favour of revolutionary defeatism and victory to the Third Reich. So you have to think about the concrete circumstances. I mean, in those circumstances, who was it? Who were the defeatists? Actually, it was the right. It was the pro-fascist elements within the British ruling class. So, I mean, in a sense, by having to go along with the war, you're actually taking you were fighting them, and so I mean, for Syrians, it is very difficult. I mean, I think it was George Orwell, but it must be somebody else, saying it was very, very difficult in September 1939 for revolutionary socialists to find themselves on the same side as the Daily Telegraph. Sometimes, you know, you just have to think these things through a little bit more than the slogans. I've got no solution for the Syrian thing, but I mean, the sort of being a historian, I suppose, it comes naturally to me. Thinking about the thing in historical context is, you know, let's just think about the concrete circumstances for the moment and not just get ourselves stuck with the slogans.
Yeah, I agree with John that the outbreak of the Second World War is a difficult case, but I think it's a more obvious one in terms of thinking about accepting arms. It's one that we're remembering 100 years ago today, which is the Irish Rising at Easter in 1916. The rebels did actually get guns from Germany, you know, and we did condemn them for that. They had to get guns from somewhere. They weren't going to get them from the British. And similarly, if the Kurds get guns from the Americans, I mean, what are they supposed to do? Set up an arms factory in Rojava? I mean, they have to get arms from somewhere. The point is, are they acting in the interests of American imperialism, or are they simply coinciding by getting the arms from there to use against their actual enemies? I think you have to start from that point rather than simply using these kind of blanket arguments. It's a core argument where the class struggle is going on. I entirely agree about the main enemy at home, however, being a thing that's become, some people are obsessed with this to the point of anything else. You know, the main enemy is home, it's not the only enemy. Lenin didn't say, you know, we went up a civil war and returned the war to civil war in Russia, but not in Germany or England or Japan. It was all of those countries he wanted the war to be done into a civil war and to be brought down. And when he said we want the defeat of our own country, he didn't mean the defeat of our own country by the opposing forces, he meant by the working class in those countries. You know, i.e. the Syrian working class in the case of Syria, the Russian working class in the case of Putin. So I think we need to think about that, and I'll come back to this in the session this afternoon, but the main enemy is at home, it's just not the only enemy.
Great contribution, because one isn't really, I don't think, but do my best. But one of the things that struck me about talking about Syria, and maybe it's just in my head and not in anybody else's head here, is that how easy it is just to box a thing in and think, there's Syria over there, there's Argentina over here, and there's Iceland up there, and that's how we kind of read the world that we're in. And the reason I thought that is because I was reading recently some writings by somebody that a lot of people here almost wouldn't know, is a half joke, but Tony Cliff writing about Portugal in 1974, and great analysis of where the revolution came from, what happened during it, blah, blah, blah. But the one thing I felt he'd left out was actually what happened to Portugal very shortly after those years. Massive number of Portuguese emigrated to other parts of Europe, other affluent parts of Europe, which he didn't take any account of at all in his own analysis of what was going on there. Now likewise, it made me think about Syria, the mass immigration of people out of Syria, for obvious reasons, plus the imperialist effect that everybody's battling over that home ground to try and get back in and stab to death any independent working class action that happens anywhere else in the world. And it just remains important in my head to kind of think of Syria in an international context, not in a national context. It's not all going to be sorted out within the kind of dust and ruins and remaining towns of Syria. It's going to be sorted out in the countries we live in, America, Russia, and so on, just in the same way that Portugal was buffeted into the situation it was in 74 and also found its expression beyond that in an international context.
Gets through this. I wanted to start by saying I agree, first of all, with what Neil said, that the main enemy at home doesn't mean that's the only enemy, and if we forget that, we get ourselves into a terrible mess. And it seems to me some on the left, over the question of Syria, have precisely got into this mess, because they see the main enemy at home as somehow excusing the actions of Putin, etc., meaning you can remain silent about it. And that's simply not valid. It's not a revolutionary view, it's not a socialist view, it's a view that completely lacks solidarity with the struggle. But I also want to take on the question of where you get arms from, because there's two different questions, and I think it's important we separate them. Yes, the Irish got arms from Imperial Germany, the IRA got arms from Imperial Germany in 1916, they were quite right to take them. The German left would not call upon the German ruling class to intervene in that struggle, quite right not to, because they would have no illusion in what the class interests of the German ruling class were. It was always my view that you should support the Afghan rebels against the Russians, even though they got arms from the United States. I thought they were right to take them. It would have been completely wrong of the American left to call on the United States to get involved in that struggle. Here, Syrian revolutionaries should take arms from wherever they get them, and that should have no bearing on what we think of the Syrian revolutionaries. We should support them. There's a difference between that and us having illusions that any intervention by our ruling class would be anything other than in the interests of our ruling class. And that, to me, is the key way in which we have to view the question.
How the militarisation has affected women's organising in the revolution, the problems it's created, some of the clashes, but also the way that this has kind of been organising has been underreported massively. I think that would be good to bring up.
Again, I'm afraid it's a question I'm going to take to answer, please. But I'd be very interested if either of you could say anything about what the practical consequences have been of the British intervention. There's been almost a complete blackout here in terms of any coverage at all, and you could almost have an idea, I don't know if this is true, that it's been less about a military presence than it has been about Cameron trying to get stakes on the table for the peace negotiations and trying to gain stakes. But literally, I've got very poor sense of that's right. Have there been reports from civil society organisations that our troops have been responsible for deaths? Have we been amongst the people who've been bombing the hospitals?
For all the questions. I'm going to first make a quick comment on the middle class and the role of middle class in the coordination committees. And I think there are a few things. I'll speak from a family experience. In the 60s and 70s, it's only poor people who had no choice but to go get education. Because the rich people in the middle class actually could afford not to get education because they have businesses or they have lands. It's the poor people, the very poor people, who needed to go get education. And that reflected in the 70s and 80s and 90s. In where my father comes from the south, it has the highest education rate as in high school and university education in the country, although it's quite impoverished, it's left out by the regime and so on. What I'm trying to say is that the working class in Syria have, as a percentage, have a very high percentage of education. And that we saw in the organization of the coordination committees. They're definitely not the middle class people. They were the working class who did the coordination. They are the ones who went to the street. A few people from the middle class did, but the majority were the working class who identified with it, who had very direct interest, and who faced violations, who faced most of the violations and didn't have any buffer to protect them, like middle class or people who are closer to the regime or rich. So this issue sometimes it's very hard, it's very complicated, and I'm not assuming that I can tackle it now or at all, but it's something to be kept into consideration. And the other issue on arms. We do a lot of arms research, and there's something that I keep facing when we have these conversations on weapons, that we are still using the same arguments from the time where weapons were, where the warfare was two warring parties who would go into a field and shoot at each other. And it's not the case anymore. Weapons have developed to the point, they have developed far more than the normative legal the discourse. They have developed far more than our ideologies. People are being killed by drones operated from a continent away. And in Syria, this is very, very clear. It's not small arms that's killing people. It's massive arms operated by group. And when we're speaking about these arms and about clean hands, none of these arms are not killing civilians. This glorifying of arms and of the warfare as protection and so on. I know this is a very controversial discourse that I'm putting here, but we have seen how people who held arms with the best intentions in the world couldn't, after a few months, were either turned into warlords, or some of them had to leave their arms. Some of them are still operating, but they are a minority. What I'm trying to say is, this direct connection between giving arms and actually winning a revolution or supporting a cause is not that direct anymore with the current warfare and with the current nature of arms and with the people who are targeted by them. I really don't think sending more arms to any group, the best group, my group, if you send more arms to me to protect myself, that wouldn't actually dictate that I'll win, and it will not dictate that this is the battlefield that I want to operate in. The issue of arms too has moved the battle from an ideological one and one of civilians who are trying to make a difference into a battlefield where we have very little and the regime has so much. And our armed groups have so much, and those who are coming from outside the country have so much, have far more power than the Syrians, than the Syrian people. I'm again not assuming that the Syrian people who are holding arms are supporting another cause. They're obviously supporting the same cause. I'm just saying that I'd be very extremely cautious when calling for more arms to go to the country, or supposing that things will be solved by arms. And what I can say on that is that there's so many things that can be done without actual aggression, without involving, imposing such misery on people. If all the arms that are going legally to Syria could be controlled, the death of civilians would have dropped immensely. If the massive deals of arms that's sent by Russia to the Syrian regime were controlled in 2012, we'd have 300,000 people alive today who are no longer alive. I would put this into consideration, and that also goes into the question of intervention and boots on the ground. What I'm saying is the people we work with, civil society, women groups, civilians who still want to have the option of not having to hold arms to defend themselves, are being extremely impacted by this pushing of the discourse into a battlefield. And I hope this answers Mark's question. The research we've done and the groups we work with, one of the worst things that are happening to them is the fluctuation of support, because ISIS takes a village in the east and suddenly all the civil society groups around Aleppo stop getting support because there are possibilities of ISIS coming close to where they are. A whole of government approach in many donor countries and donor organizations. The second worst challenge to them is armed groups. Even at their own side, even armed groups that includes their own husbands and children are still imposing a lot of threat to them. And it varies. Sometimes they're not allowed to continue their advocacy or activism because it's not time for it, or because it's not helping the cause and so on. But at other times it's just having more arms, more small arms among the places around them to give enough protection for them to move around. One of the cases we studied was that women in Atme refugee camp, the men holding arms had a fight over a parking space and 17 people were killed because everybody has arms and they're angry and they can use them, and they did. Women in that refugee camp managed to have some sort of an agreement that was applied, that there's no arms, no small arms allowed in public spaces, in the market, and in areas where there are children, where women are, if you want to use your arms, use them out of the camp. This is just one of many examples on how there's an extreme need of safe spaces, and they need to be big. They don't need to be a small space for people to go hide from this hostility outside. They actually need this to be generalized and available. On the reconstruction, I absolutely agree. It's extremely important that we set these asks and the leads now on a reconstruction process. It's just the amount of hostilities, I'm finishing now, the amount of hostilities is not allowing any consideration of that. And for those of us who have the luxury of even considering this, the changes in alliances and the political process has a massive stake at this. So the way the stopping of hostilities, whether through peace or the way this will be conducted will kind of dictate most of the reconstruction. And what we can do from the outside is to make sure that this same civilian lens that we were speaking about, because armed groups take a lot of money to operate, and they require money, unlike civilians who do not do it the same way. They don't find the courage or to request this construction as quickly as armed groups find the courage to ask for arms and so on. So it's very important to look at reconstruction from a civilian eye, and how and on the refugees. Everybody is speaking about resettling refugees, which is extremely important in some cases. It's very important to find solution for millions of people who had to flee immense violence. But the thing that's disappearing from the discourse is how to provide safe, voluntary return and dignified return for these people who want to go back. And if the country continues to be flooding with arms and flooding with violence that nobody's stopping, they will never have this option, and they should have. And that's what should be done for refugees. This is what refugees should be able.
Stalinist Communist Party of Baghdad's tradition. And so it was used as a corporate institution to control the workers. In the same time, give them some amount of services in a kind of a negotiation, but from above. In Egypt, you had also the general trade union controlled by the state that was used by Mubarak, by Morsi and Sisi to crush any kind of working class organization. But you had in Egypt independent trade unions that played a humongous role in organizing process, etc. Even though some of them took a very bad position following the overthrow of Morsi to support Sisi. Notably, one very famous was, I forgot his name. He became Minister of Labor. He was invited to Marxism a couple of years ago. He's a nationalist. Kamal Abouita.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, voilà. This is the thing. Regarding the Rojava revolution, I would just like to make a precision. Not all anarchists support the Rojava revolution just in a very uncritical way. You have various anarchist positions, and not only Stalinists as well. I would just like to remind that people from a Trotskyist background have been taken very bad position regarding the Syrian revolution, and Tariq Ali, John Rees and other, Lindsey German, etc. I don't want to take into these details. So they have been saying since 2012 the revolution is dead. I've been hearing this every year. Revolution is dead 2012, revolution is dead 2013, 2014, 15, 16. Next year they will say it again when the people coming out. So so it's not really, and I invite, we have a very good activist here, Laila, to read also the book Burning in the Country of Syria's Revolution, Laila and Robin, about these kind of aspects of the popular organization on the field as well. Very interesting. The whole question about the arming is very complicated. First of all, I would just like to remind that it was forced upon the Syrian people to militarize. And in the first case, it was to defend the continuation of the democratic revolution, the popular demands, etc. So it was people from their neighborhoods organizing at the entry of neighborhoods to protect the demonstrations. And for 6 months, so when I hear the arguments, the first time I hear it, I don't know who said, prematurely they militarized. What do you expect after 6 months? People being killed on a daily basis, 20 people, and it was premature? Oh my God, I don't, after 2 days, especially in Syria, that is a country where everyone, and even before, had weapons for 6 months, it wasn't enough to wait. So this is the first thing. It was self-organized in the beginning, through various means to bring in arms, not foreign countries. This is the first thing. And historically speaking, when the domination of armed groups on the popular movement is problematic. Let's say it very clearly. We've seen it in the Palestinian Revolution uprising in the 80s, where you had huge popular organization in the Palestinians. It brought the Intifada of 87-88. But this was working from popular from below popular organization. You can see the difference with the 2000 Intifada. And it was mostly militarized. It was 5 to 10% of people participating in the Intifada, while in the 80s, it was 80 to 90% of the population, with women playing a huge importance. And we cannot deny that in the Syrian revolutionary process, definitely, with the increasing militarization, women's role played a less important. But this was forced upon the Syrian people. It wasn't, on many aspects, it wasn't a choice. And after, I think, if there was a possibility, and this has not been done, unfortunately, to have a free Syrian army that was really institutionalized with a key leadership, receiving the weapons to distribute it to democratic forces, but submitted to local councils, it would have been a very different story. This, unfortunately, was not the case. And this is why Syrian people don't have any friends, because even the friends of Syria, what happened Saudi Arabia, Qatar and Turkey, first of all, they had their own ways to fund various groups. So it was never done in a united way. So various groups in the beginning fought for this funding. Some adopting increasingly an Islamized language because it was the way to bring in arms. And it was very famous. You had one guy doing the video, very with Islamic language, etc., etc. He came out from the video. He was dancing in the streets, speaking, and this was very common. It's not an excuse, but this so. And after there was the funding of Islamic fundamentalist group, because they don't want a successful Syrian revolution. They want a sectarian civil war in Syria. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey, with their own political interest, wanted to transform this popular revolution into a sectarian war, because the biggest thrust for them is to see democracy in Syria. And this is why we have to be very clear that they are as well enemies of the Syrian revolution. And obviously, the first who has used sectarianism even before the revolution was the Assad regime. Let's make it very clear. Because when they did popular massacres against Sunni popular villages from working class background, it was made in mixed areas. It wasn't made in Damascus or in other areas. It was in Homs, Hama, and in the periphery of this region. Because he knows that he wanted popular people from various backgrounds, ethnic and religious, to not unite. Since the first day, the biggest threat to the Assad regime is democratic activists having a democratic and non-sectarian propaganda. And this has been even before. And these are the same people that, again, as I said, that were working against the various counter-revolutionary forces. And also the play of Iran in the sectarian language has to be put forward. Hezbollah. It wasn't only about so-called defending the resistance, it was defending the Shia in a very sectarian way. People of Hezbollah soldiers coming with Ya Hussein on the forefront when they're fighting against Syrian people. And in Dahi, the way they talked, etc. On the issue of weapons, I invite you, and I wrote it many times, to read what Trotsky said, learn how to think. He says very bluntly, he gives the example of Algeria. If the fascist Italia gave arm to the Algerian struggling against French domination, should French workers oppose it? Obviously not. Secondly, the best way to show the contradictions, because not a single time did the West wanted regime change in Syria. Not a single day. Even the issue about chemical weapons, and I'm sorry to say it very bluntly, but Stop the War movement saying they stopped the intervention in Syria is completely bullshit. Not a single movement, the British bourgeoisie wanted to intervene in Syria to overthrow this regime. Not a single moment. Let's be very clear. It was, they want to maintain this regime. So it's showing the contradictions of your ruling bourgeoisie by saying, send arms to the democratic sections of the revolution. But again, with all the contradictions you said, and I agree, but for me, people need to defend themselves and should be submitted to the popular councils. This, unfortunately, was not all the time the case, which is the biggest problem. How to help, and I'll try to conclude, there's one thing, class dynamics. Some people, and they see revolutions as a theoretical thing. So it means, the Syrian revolutionary process has an independent working class. No, shit. So we take it, no. Let's go to the other thing. Is it having, asking for independent trade unions? No, it's not the kingdom action. So it's not the Syrian. So it's not a revolutionary process. This is completely mad. And again, go back to your classics. And Lenin tells, in a revolution you will find various groups, but your duty is to radicalize the revolution and go to the people that are protesting and against authoritarian, capitalist, reactionary regime, and radicalize, work with them, and in struggle, this is basics, they will radicalize and they will learn. And what we've seen in the Syrian revolution is amazing. People radicalizing through times, opposing Assad regime, after opposing other oppressors. You have many example papers saying we will not accept any kind of repression, whether religious or so-called secular. It's been very key. How to help? This is very important. Obviously, it's doing, I think, kinds of like this, events, speaking about the Syrian revolution, helping democratic activists on the ground, if it's possible. But also, when it comes to the Syrian refugee issue, not treating it as a humanitarian issue. It's a politicized issue, just as we don't treat Gaza, that has been under siege for for years, as a humanitarian issue. It's a political issue, just as the refugees. Why did they come to Europe? Because of the authoritarian regime, mainly. Far many, 70-80%, because of the Assad regime, Daesh, etc. But not only saying you have to fight, because it's also linked to our own class interest for fighting for them to be able not to survive in Europe, but to live. Because if they only survive, they won't be politically active. And these people have revolutionary power that we need to learn from them. And they've been self-organizing in Eastern Europe. Many much demonstrations, etc., self-organizing. We have to learn, but this means also fighting for housing for them, working conditions, etc. Not able. This is linked directly to our own popular class interest. Fighting against racism and Islamophobia. It means that not fighting against the fact that the propaganda of saying every Syrian refugee is a Daesh. This is key also. Fighting against this. Fighting against, obviously, neoliberal policies. And this meaning, you understand, by this, taking this internationalist position, that the main enemy is at home. But not saying you're not in solidarity with people in uprising. But even if you see the text of Karl Lieberknecht, it's very clear. He never says you're not in solidarity with workers of the world. He says it very clear. It's like people saying, using, the quote of Karl Marx, religion is opium of the people, and not seeing the whole text. It's absolutely the same thing. They use one quote and khalas, it's finished, yani. No, on the opposite, you see the whole text opposing foreign intervention, but supporting solidarity with the workers of the world. And how is it difficult to do this? It's not impossible. So this is what I would say, how to help. I think it's key, and it's linked to the working class of Europe completely. And this is how we understand it. Not in a moralistic or humanitarian way. It's a political issue that we are fully involved into it and that we have to fight for.